endorse ideals of Eurocentric beauty. Could you begin by unpacking that statement?
Yeah, sure. So skin lighteners are actually a very, very old cosmetic that go back really centuries in one form or another. So they have been popular in the ancient Mediterranean world, as well as in East Asia, going back quite far. But the skin lighteners that we know today, I would say the most important part of their history is really the history over the past 150 years. So these are products that have been sold commercially, and the active ingredients they contain have historically been mercury or more recently hydroquinone. And then more recently, there are even more active ingredients. So I would say the beauty ideal that they fostered, so one of a light colored skin, a blemish-free skin, is an ideal that had its roots in the history of racialized slavery, and colonialism, and segregation, and in South Africa, apartheid as well. But it is also important to note that these were cosmetics that were very commonly used by white women in the early 20th century. So in the 1920s or 30s, they shift from being a cosmetic used by white women and some women of color to being a cosmetic that's really primarily associated with women of color. And that's because seasonal tanning begins in the 1920s and 30s as a new form of white privilege that many white women embrace.
When the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement began, many industries endorsed the cause, and certain companies which actively encouraged skin lightening did too. This is clearly deeply ironic. Would you care to delve into that?
Yeah, sure. So when the Black Lives Matter protests kind of restarted after the murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis, so when those protests, which had been there for a number of years but restarted really, or had new life in May and June, a number of corporations, big corporations, came out to voice their support for the Black Lives Matter protesters and for moving towards better racial justice. So some cosmetic companies joined those corporate endorsements of the movement, and among them were companies that sold skin lightening products mainly outside of the U.S., so mainly in parts of Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and to a certain extent in Africa as well. So when activists then saw these companies endorsing Black Lives Matter in the U.S. while they were selling skin lightener products abroad, those activists rightly called those companies on their hypocrisy. So the companies have responded partially, at least. So Johnson & Johnson has agreed to stop selling a skin lightening product that it has sold in South and Southeast Asia. But the bigger players have agreed to far smaller changes. So L'Oreal, which is the largest cosmetic company in the world, and then Unilever, which makes the brand Fair and Lovely, which is very well known in South Asia. So both of those companies didn't agree to stop making their products, but what they agreed to do was to change the marketing language around them. So they agreed to stop using words like white or light or fairness in marketing them. And Unilever has said it will change the name of Fair and Lovely to Glow and Lovely. So, and rightly, activists have responded that those measures are really inadequate.
And then in the South African context, following the dismantling of the apartheid regime, fair skin tones were still associated with beauty and success, and this led to the growth of the skin lightener industry in the country. Many remnants of the age of apartheid still pervade the era of democracy, and this is one of them. Why do you think that this has been the case?
So South Africa is actually a really, really special case, and my book goes into this quite a bit. So South Africa is really noteworthy across the globe as being the country that actually has on the books the toughest regulations on skin lighteners. And so these regulations were put in place in 1990. So during the anti-apartheid movement of the late 1970s and into the 1980s, opposition to skin lighteners became kind of an issue within that movement. It was kind of a corollary of the anti-apartheid movement. And opposition to skin lighteners in the late 70s and in the 1980s came from two different directions. So on the one hand, you had Black consciousness activists who liked Black Power activists in the US or African nationalists elsewhere in Africa opposed skin lighteners on political grounds, right? They said the promotion of skin lighteners and people's use of them was evidence of the deep structural racism within society. And so they were against the industry and they did what they could to discourage people from using them. So you had that political critique of skin lighteners. Then at the same time, there was a medical critique. So there were dermatologists in South Africa, so mainly white medical professionals, but also some medical professionals of color who were also very, very worried about skin lighteners as well. And they were worried about the health effects that the active ingredients, whether it was mercury or hydroquinone, actually had on the body. And what happens under the umbrella of the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s is those two forms of critique come together and they put pressure on the apartheid government. So really in the waning months of apartheid, the government passed this regulation that not only banned the active ingredients, but also said that it was illegal for cosmetic companies to advertise any product that claimed to lighten, whiten, or bleach the skin. And South Africa is really the only country in the world today that still has that second part of the regulation. So that was actually a really significant thing that South Africa did in 1990. What happens then over the course of the late 1990s and then into the 2000s and up until the present day is that an illicit or an illegal trade in skin lighteners has come back into South Africa. So initially, those products were imported from elsewhere, but now some of them are actually manufactured in South Africa. So now you definitely have a situation in South Africa today where skin lightening products are pretty widely available and they come in all different forms. And so there you can certainly see that the underlying kind of racism and colorism, so those hierarchies continue to exist. But I do think it's really important to recognize in terms of the global history and understanding of skin lighteners that South Africa actually has a pretty unique place in that history. And it's actually a place where there was the greatest activism against these products, I would say, before now the Black Lives Matter movement.
Okay. And then it has been predicted that the global trade in skin lighteners will reach a staggering $24 billion by 2027, despite the problematic nature of these products. Do you personally believe that the acknowledgement of these issues and subsequently the changes made by these companies will reduce this figure?
Yeah, I guess you can say what the companies have done is a start, but there would need to be a lot more done. And I think what would need to be done would really be on two different fronts. The first is really to raise people's consciousness about the fact that everyone's most beautiful skin color is their natural skin color. So to raise that awareness, to really kind of confront or counter the messages that will come from the cosmetic industry, whether it's smaller companies or in kind of more subtle ways. So I think there needs to be a consciousness raising that really pushes back on racist and colorist beauty ideals. So that's one part of it. But then the other part of it is that governments need to enforce the regulations that they have on the books. So those are regulations against the harmful active ingredients. And if they don't have those regulations on the books, they need to make those regulations. But there really is a super important role that I think government agencies and regulatory agencies, enforcement agencies need to play in all of this.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for exploring the issue of the skin lightening industry in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Great. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
That was Lynn Thomas, a professor of African history at the University of Washington, Seattle, where she is also an adjunct faculty member in anthropology and gender, women and sexuality studies, talking to us about the history of skin lightening products and its contemporary significance amid the Black Lives Matter movement. And that brings us to the end of this afternoon's show. Remember that this segment can be found on our Facebook and Twitter pages. From myself, Humairaa Mayet, and the team at Salam Media, thank you